thank you for having me today. I'm actually coming to you from a museum background, but museums and libraries, as I'm sure you know, have a lot of overlap, a lot of similarities, and I personally love libraries, so I'm excited to be here. What I'm going to present today is sort of a distillation of the research from my dissertation, which looked at how income inequality affects access to museums and libraries. So just a working definition. So my research looked at the locations of museums, libraries, and arts organizations within cities and how that relates to the income inequality in those cities. I am just going to say informal education, so I don't have to keep saying museums, libraries, and arts organizations. So just a working definition of informal education. Basically, museums, aquariums, zoos, libraries, botanical gardens, and cultural institutions are considered sites for informal education. So why is informal education important? Well, 90% of adult learning comes in the form of informal education. Informal education is important. It helps adults with continuing life skills. So for example, someone who wants to, say, learn Excel to improve their resume can go to the library, check out a book, and do some self-directed study of Excel. For families, visiting informal education institutions can help inspire learning on multiple levels. So a family group can go to an exhibit, and the parents learn the information for themselves and then distill it to the children on a level that's appropriate for them. So learning is taking place at multiple different levels. Informal education can also spark lifelong learning, show that learning is important and exciting even when you're past formal schooling. And it also allows people to look at subjects they might not have previously considered or have an opportunity to learn about. Importantly, informal education allows people to learn what they like, when they like, at whatever pace they like. They don't have to follow the strictures of a classroom to learn. They can learn things that personally interest them at a pace that's convenient for them. And informal education facilitates personal development, a sense of community. It helps create a bridge to formal learning. So informal education can show people that learning is actually fun and maybe provide people a boost to pursue further formal education that they might not already have. So then some facts about income inequality, since my study did look at income inequality in cities. So in the 20th century, income inequality was at its lowest point in 1953, but since then, income inequality has only been steadily increasing. From 1979 till now, so for about the past 40 years, the bottom 20% of earners in this country have seen their incomes rise by 18%. The top 1% of earners in this country have seen their incomes rise by 275%. So that shows you how income inequality is very much steadily growing. And this is an income inequality that outpaces what we see in other developed countries around the world. Income inequality has a lot of effects on people's lives, importantly on education. One of the biggest pieces of research, the thing that stuck with me most when doing background research for my dissertation was this. Quote, an American child's chance of acquiring a quality education depends more on the parent's income than on anything else. So income inequality has a really big effect on educational attainment in our country. In fact, educational attainment perpetuates income inequality. People who are able to get a better education have a greater chance of going to college, which means they have a greater chance of earning a high income, which means their children have a better chance of getting a better education, and so on. And the opposite is true for poor families. Income inequality perpetuates educational attainment. Currently, 25% of our public school students around the country live in poverty. And again, that is a percentage that is much higher than we see in other developed countries around the world. And it has been estimated that if we could close the gap between the quality of education that rich and poor children receive, we could add $670 billion to our economic GDP. So another factor I looked at in this study is economic segregation, and that's the phenomenon of people of different income levels living together. That's why we have rich neighborhoods and poor neighborhoods. People tend to segregate themselves with others who earn similar levels that they do. In fact, income is the biggest factor in where people live, and it is the primary form of segregation we currently see in our cities. Since 1980, income inequality has risen in all but one of the 250 largest cities in this country. And 85% of all urban neighborhoods currently are more economically segregated than they were in the year 1980. And this has some real consequences. Negative consequences for the poor. Income inequality and economic segregation is linked to higher mortality, higher unemployment, lower earnings, and more social problems in the areas where they live. Economic segregation also increases the likelihood that a child will not graduate from high school. And private schooling actually just increases this problem. It increases economic segregation when you take wealthier kids or kids who have better educational outcomes and take them out of the public schools and put them in private schools. It just leaves behind schools filled with poorer kids, kids who are struggling more, and schools have to devote resources to dealing with those problems and less resources to actually teaching. Meanwhile, if you're wealthy, economic segregation actually produces better outcomes from you. For one, not being around people of a different income level than you it tends to make you vote for policies that benefit you and exclude others. Things like lower taxes, or governors, legislators who favor your interests and exclude the interests of poorer folks. And in economically segregated areas, the wealthier tend to go to college more often than those who live in economically diverse areas. So again, it perpetuates educational attainment for the wealthy at the expense of the poor. So in total, economic segregation is self-perpetuating and multi-generational. It just, once it starts, it keeps going, and it's felt down through the years. And it is particularly glaring in cities. So I chose to study economic segregation and access to informal education in cities because it's very noticeable. When you have people in a city who, you have a rich neighborhood here and a poor neighborhood very close by, you notice how the wealthier are living better than you. If you think about it, here in New York, you can be living in Brownsville, Brooklyn, one of the poorest neighborhoods in the whole city. You can get on the C train, and 45 minutes later, you're on the Upper West Side. So you can see what a stark difference that is. And there has been not very many studies on how income affects informal education, just a few, but the research I could found showed that low-income children in urban areas had less access to books, mostly because they lacked equal access to libraries in their neighborhoods that wealthier neighborhoods had. Museums are also less accessible to lower income people in cities. As income inequality has increased, there is less and less money for leisure activities like museums, paying museum admissions, and so museums are not as valued in lower income neighborhoods as they were in times past. And because I'm a museum person myself, I looked up research that found that museums in particular are seen as catering to the privileged, so they're something that rich people do. Funded by mistrusted institutions. There's a lot of museum funding that can look kind of questionable on the surface. Dependent on low-wage structures. I know as a museum person myself, there's tons of museum jobs that do not pay a living wage. And that museums are lacking the right to interpret certain histories. So if you have a mostly white staff, it can be a little bit glaring to have them put on an African-American history exhibit, when in fact there's not a lot of African-American representation in staffing. However, informal education has been shown to have benefits for lower income folks. It provides an outlet for unheard voices, so exhibits on different cultures, or information in libraries on different cultures. It provides a safe place, and it provides for inclusion. It encourages economic development. Museums and libraries are still seen as good for neighborhoods. It allows for unstructured learning, so people who don't have the time to sit down and take a formal class can still access learning and learning about things they enjoy. Informal education promotes tolerance and encourages social justice. So with those benefits being said, those are benefits that low-income neighborhoods need, and yet we have to work to combat barriers to entry to provide these benefits for lower-income neighborhoods. So let me tell you a little bit about what I did. So the goal of my research was two-part. First, I wanted to figure out whether access is equal to informal education in lower-income and higher-income neighborhoods. So what I did is I looked at 3 cities, Philadelphia, Chicago, and Los Angeles, and I chose those cities because I was able to find the best data there. And I divided each of those cities into all their zip codes, and I researched the median income in each zip code. Then I pulled up lists of every museum, library, and arts organization in those cities, and I tracked what zip code those institutions were located in. And then I did a data analysis of how many informal education institutions were in each zip code and how that correlated to the median income of those zip codes. And then I also wanted to actually get the voices of lower income urban residents to see how they themselves felt about informal education. So I identified the 2 lowest income zip codes in Philadelphia, and I did surveys with residents in those 2 zip codes. So I'm going to give you some data charts now. So for the city of Philadelphia, this was the range of median incomes by zip code in the city. The richest neighborhood had a median income yearly of about $89,000. The poorest zip code had a median income of about $13,000 per year. And this is a track of the informal education institutions in each neighborhood. So the income of the neighborhood versus where or how many informal education institutions were in each zip code. And you can see that it tended to be that the wealthier zip code, the wealthier zip code was, the more informal education institutions it had. And indeed, data analysis showed that that was the case. The wealthier neighborhoods had better access to museums and libraries. In Chicago, again, median incomes, the wealthiest neighborhood in Chicago had a median annual income of about $130,000. The poorest was about $19,000 a year. And the location of those informal education institutions, once again, it tended that wealthier neighborhoods had more local informal education institutions, and the data, again, showed that that was true. And in Los Angeles, I apologize, that is a very small graph. There are a lot of people in Los Angeles. The wealthiest neighborhood in Los Angeles had a median annual income of about $165,000 per year. Poorest neighborhood had a median income of about $15,000 per year. And this one was actually interesting. So there was really no trend in this data in Los Angeles. Informal education institutions were pretty spread out no matter what a neighborhood's median income was. And doing a little further research, there were some who suggested that because Los Angeles is a newer city, so Philadelphia and Chicago, Philadelphia is about 400 years old, Chicago's about 300 years old. Being a younger city meant that class structures were not as prevalent in Los Angeles as they are in older East Coast, Midwest cities. And then just quickly about interviews. So in surveying low-income people in Philadelphia, they said that they enjoy museums and libraries. They believe that these institutions provide educational and technological opportunities. So they have chances to learn. They have chances to use, for example, computers that they might not have at home. They see them as good places where they can have fun and family-friendly activities, so a good place to do something with your kids. And they believe that informal education improves neighborhoods financially. They believe it increases home prices to have a library or a museum in their neighborhoods, and also that it's just culturally a good thing to have locally. But they also said they encountered place-based problems in accessing libraries and museums. So they believe that it can be difficult to get to a good library, a good museum. Some of them said, it would take 2 buses and a train to get to the central library where they have a lot of resources. I would have to take a cab. I can't afford car fare. They see financial and logistical barriers to visiting. So not necessarily for libraries, but for museums, they felt they were unaffordable with admission prices. But logistically, lower income people are more likely to work odd hours, and they felt that museums and libraries were not always open in a way that fit their schedule. And they also felt that events and programs at libraries and museums could be more practically helpful for them. So while they enjoy, say, having the chance for their kids to do a Chinese New Year event, they would also like resources like, how do I do my taxes, or what are some good strategies for job seekers applying for jobs. So overall, lower income urban residents really do value libraries and museums, but they encounter not insignificant problems in accessing them, which is where the data showing that in general, higher income neighborhoods have more local and formal education institutions really plays out. So now that you've sat here listening to me, I'm interested in some of your suggestions. So now that we know that this is true, what are some things that we as library people, museum people, can do to combat this? Obviously, we cannot just pick up our libraries and museums and put them down in neighborhoods that need more resources. So what can we do instead to reach people who don't have the same access to libraries and museums? So if we can, I'd like to have everybody turn and talk with their neighbors and just spend about 5 minutes, maybe less, coming up with ideas of what we each at our institutions can individually do to combat this. So did anybody have any cool ideas they were able to brainstorm during that brief few minutes? If not, I'll just share briefly some of the things that I thought of in concluding this research. So doing things like outreach, going into where people are who don't necessarily have great access to informal education, bringing materials, bringing resources to them, going into their communities. Off-hours programming, so figuring out where the people who need these resources, what their schedules are when they personally are free, and trying to do programming along those schedules. Seeking out grants and sponsorships for these programs, so we actually have sustainable funding to do these kind of things, not just doing a one-off and saying, well, we did it, we tried, but something that's sustainable. And in general, just making it as easy as possible for people who don't have great access to informal education to get to us, or for us to get to them. Did anybody have any questions they wanted to ask? Yeah.
Well, I just want to give another example. So, like in Chicago, and I'm sure other folks do this, we were talking about like how libraries at least are a little bit more accessible than museums, at least in terms of cost. But
yes.
That, like at CPL, for example, they have museum passes that you can check out and go for free. Or another example is parks. There's natural parks and things like that. So those kinds of services are also.
Exactly. Yeah. Are there any other questions? Yeah.
Did you see any differences by type of institution? So I guess you like zoos versus libraries.
I didn't do any kind of formal analysis of museums versus libraries versus theater companies or things like that, but just from collating the data, libraries were more accessible than museums or arts institutions. They were a little better at trying to equally represent in neighborhoods of different income levels.
Well, we were talking about going into the community or communities, but as we were talking about it, it occurred to me that one possible problem with that is that with a lot of arts institutions, libraries, etc., they're elite institutions, and when they go into poor neighborhoods, they can be seen as part of gentrification or kind of a colonial type of relationship. Like, here we're going to bring you culture and the benefits of our wonderful things that you can have too. So how would, I'm just wondering how you would avoid that, or is that a question to be asked in this particular context?
I mean, I think that goes back to the point of having a diverse staff, having a staff that represents not the neighborhood that your institution is in, but the actual population of your entire city. Because yes, if you're, a white academic going into a neighborhood where that's, minority and majority, and where people don't have high educational attainment, that is kind of seen as a form of gentrification. But if you're making an effort to have staff that reflects the diversity of your city, and you send more diverse people into those neighborhoods, that's probably a better outcome.
Well, one of the reasons I love going to ALA is talking to people around the country, and they always have fabulous ideas, and you go to really great sessions there as well. But I grew up in Oklahoma, and when I go back there now, the Pioneer Library System does something which I'm sure a lot of other libraries do for their public services. They have these automated checkouts which are 24/7, so they supplement the hours that services are available, and you can check out books and videos and everything, and I've used it and it's fabulous. It really extends the service, and I live in the Lower Hudson Valley now, and so it used to be very difficult for me to get to the library in the evenings, and now I'm a library trustee as well. We have trouble with funding, keeping the library open as many hours as we used to. So I'm pushing to try to get funding to have one of those, and maybe a couple in our community, that would allow people coming back on the train to check out books or drop them off or whatever. So extending our service that way, and then I think we should all bring back bookmobiles. Because I lived in some small communities, and although I love libraries as a librarian and as an archivist, but bookmobiles are fabulous. They're like food trucks for your mind.
That's the log line. Unfortunately, we don't have time for any more questions because we're going to move to the next presentation, but